I was driving through Montana last summer with my wife, and we saw one of those roadside pulpits, wayside pulpits in front of a church, and it had a quotation from John Wesley on it that said, "If you are on fire with enthusiasm, people will come from miles around to watch you burn." My wife said, "Yeah, what kind of people?" Anyway, the book starts like this. March 29th, 1832, the 28-year-old Emerson visited the tomb of his young wife, Ellen, who had been buried a year and 2 months earlier. He was in the habit of walking from Boston out to her grave in Roxbury every day. But on this particular day, he did more than commune with the spirit of the departed Ellen. He opened the coffin. Ellen had been young and pretty. She was 17 when they were engaged, 18 when married, and barely 20 when she died of advanced TB. They had made frantic efforts at a cure, including long open-air carriage rides and massive doses of country air. Their life together had been stained almost from the start by the bright blood of Ellen's coughing. Imagine, doctors told you to go out and jolt TB in those days. Opening the coffin was not a grisly Gothic gesture, not just the wild aberration of an unhinged lover, though it was partly that. What Emerson was doing was not unheard of. At least two of his contemporaries did the same thing. A minister and friend of Margaret Fuller's, James Freeman Clark, opened the coffin of the woman he'd been in love with when he was an undergraduate. And Edgar Allan Poe's literary executor, the anthologist, to say nothing worse of him, Rufus Griswold, opened the coffin of his dead wife 40 days after the funeral. Emerson opened not only the tomb or the family vault, but the coffin itself. And the act was essential Emerson. He had to see for himself. Some part of him had not been able to believe she was dead. He was still writing to her in his journals as though she were alive. Perhaps the very deadness of the body would help a belief in the life of the spirit. A modern writer has it that beside the corpse of the beloved are generated not only the idea of the soul, the belief in immortality, and a great part of our deep-rooted sense of guilt, but also the beginnings of ethical law. We don't know what moved Emerson on this occasion, but we do know that he had a powerful craving for direct, personal, unmediated experience. And that's what he meant when he wrote that one should strive for an original relation to the universe. Not a novel relation, just one's own. Emerson is the great champion of self-reliance, of the adequacy of the individual, of the importance of the active soul or spirit. Never content with assertion, he always looked for the sources of strength. Emerson's lifelong search, what he called his heart's inquiry, was, whence is your power? At Ellen's grave that day in Roxbury in 1832, Emerson was standing amid the ruins of his own life, too. More than 10 years had passed since he'd left college. Love had died. His career was falling apart. He was not sure what he really believed, who he really was, or what he ought to be doing. He felt the vanishing, volatile froth of the present turning into the fixed, adamantine past. We walk, he wrote, on molten lava. Emerson's quest for some kind of inner strength really begins, I think, that day when he looks down on his young dead wife. And his search reached at least one of its high points 8 years later in the fall of 1840. So just a couple of paragraphs. Emerson was now living as intensely as he ever would. His expressive channels were all wide open, his soaring moods all constellated around the central perception that every day is both the day of creation and the day of judgment, found form in parables, poems, and dreams. His mythogenetic imagination, stirred to its core, brought out, for example, this central statement of his poem Days in a letter to Margaret Fuller in October. Heaven, he wrote, walks among us, ordinarily muffled in such triple or tenfold disguises that the wisest are deceived and no one suspects the days to be God's. And nothing expresses better than the following dream, Emerson's new ease of access to his own inner experience, the cramping hunger for life, and the fundamental sense of appetency and adequacy that he felt during what he called these flying days. I dreamed, he has this all down in his journal, I dreamed that I floated at will in the great ether, and I saw this world floating not far off, but diminished to the size of an apple. And then an angel took it in his hand and brought it to me and said, "This must thou eat," and I ate the world. This is Emerson's global Eucharist. He had come to take communion at last. The apple that Adam and Eve ate brought sin and death into the world. Newton saw that the moon was only a larger apple and its orbit a larger fall. The story of the third apple, the world that Emerson ate, marks the coming of a new kind of person, the individual, a plain man or woman, the self-reliant person who, as Virginia Woolf said years later in a review of Emerson's journals, the person who has discovered that he cannot be rejected because he carries the universe within him.